Hello and welcome. Last week I put out a video addressing some misinformation from Dr. John Campbell on ivermectin in comparison to the new Pfizer antiviral. That video got a lot more response than I was expecting, just a lot more response. And that's okay. I was grateful for the response, for the positive response, for the negative response. Well, maybe not the threats, but other than that, the negative response was fine. A few days later, Dr. Campbell put out a video that he called Miracle in Japan. And this was really about ivermectin in Japan. I found out about that video because within minutes of that video being posted, I started getting comments on my video saying, well, what about ivermectin in Japan? What do you got to say about that? So I watched Dr. Campbell's video and I thought, yeah, I should say something about that because I think, again, he's got some things wrong, or in this case, it's more that there's just no evidence, but there's a better explanation for what has happened in Japan. So that's what this video is about. It'll be mercifully shorter than the previous video. And if you're interested, stick around. So what is Dr. Campbell talking about in that video? He's talking about this situation, and he uses this data from Our World in Data, which shows new cases of COVID in Japan. Dr. Campbell points out that there was a massive spike in COVID in the summer, and that spike, which is the largest spike in COVID cases that Japan has ever seen, was followed by this really dramatic turnaround to the point where there are relatively few cases, actually very few cases, day to day in Japan. And this idea that something about ivermectin was related to it has been put around by a number of people. Dr. Pierre Corey has put this out there, and Dr. Campbell made a similar claim. And the basis of his claim is this graph that he presented. So this is from his now retitled, now it's called Ivermectin in Japan video. And the claim here is that ivermectin was allowed as a treatment on the 13th of August in Japan. And so he points this out and points out that 12 days later, the peak occurred and then it started to come down. So he notes that he says ivermectin was allowed as a treatment on the 13th of August. Now, what is this really? Was ivermectin really allowed as a treatment? Now, I want to be careful and not say anything that Dr. Campbell didn't say. So he says, no, it was not approved in Japan. It's not been approved in Japan. And he also points out that the Olympics were in the summer, and he and many people were rightly concerned about the Olympics as a possible source of COVID spread. But what he's referring to in this is what he says is ivermectin allowed as a treatment on August 13th is I think it was a speech that was picked up in some news organizations by Dr. Ozaki, who's chairman of the Tokyo Medical Association. And I won't repeat what Dr. Campbell said about Dr. Ozaki's remarks, except to say that Dr. Ozaki was saying that people should be able to get ivermectin and that perhaps they could get it through off-label prescriptions, they could have it imported and so on. And so this is what Dr. Campbell says. He refers to it as kind of a remarkable coincidence that nobody's really talking about that turned things around in Japan. So let's look at this question. Who is Dr. Ozaki and who is the Tokyo Medical Association? So the Tokyo Medical Association is a private medical professional organization, kind of like the American Medical Association, except it's regional. It's really for Tokyo and for the region around Tokyo. It's a child organization of the parent organization, which is the Japan Medical Association. Now, the Japan Medical Association didn't say anything about ivermectin, and the Tokyo Medical Association has no policy-making authority. In fact, neither does the Japan Medical Association. So it didn't have the authority to allow ivermectin as treatment, as Dr. Campbell claims, on August 13th or ever. But okay, let's just look. What did they say? Did Dr. Ozaki say on August 13th that people should go out and get ivermectin? And maybe that really happened. Maybe people listened to their regional medical Association president and went out and bought ivermectin and turned things around in Japan. So when did Dr. Ozaki talk about ivermectin? So if we go to the news, he clearly talked about it on February 9th. So he talked about it first on February 9th, well before any of this spike. And then he talked about it again on August 13th. So Dr. Ozaki has talked about ivermectin more than once. Apparently nobody listened to him when he talked about it back in February, but I guess people may have listened to him on August 13th. That's the idea of Dr. Campbell's video, that the president of the Regional Medical Association had the kind of influence to have people go out and get their own ivermectin, even though it's not approved in Japan, and turn things around. Well, that's good of them. So let's take a look at the actual data. This data, as Dr. Campbell notes, is from this Our World in Data website. And so this is the full data since the beginning of the pandemic, and this is the blown up version that Dr. Campbell presented in his video. And if we look at it, the data is available in this website, Our World in Data. And this gives us data on lots of information from many different countries, including Japan. So this is the Japan data, and you can see it looks just like Dr. Campbell's presentation of that data. One of the nice things about this data is that we can download it ourselves. And so rather than just presenting screenshots of the data, what I'm going to be doing in the rest of this video is downloading and using data for some of the comparisons that I'm going to be making. And I will put a link to a site on GitHub where my code will be, so that if you want to download the data and run this and generate your own graphs, you can do it. Okay, so this is the starting data. This is now the graph that Dr. Campbell presented that's blown up. And if I go and download the data, can I reproduce this graph? This is a good thing to do in data science. Can we reproduce this graph just to be sure? And this is what I get. So this is the data. I've plotted it over the same time range that Dr. Campbell plotted it. And this is the same data, and you can see, obviously, it's my own plot, so it's a little different. I mean, it has some different graphical affect. It is at a different color and so on, but it basically is clearly the same data. And in fact, if we can show as well when Dr. Ozaki spoke about ivermectin. So it's clear we have that data. What else was going on in this time period? Well, Dr. Campbell notes that the Olympics were happening during this time period. Well, when was that? When were the Olympics happening? Well, so that was happening here. So what I've done is I've drawn this rectangle to sandwich that it starts at the opening ceremony and ends on the date of the closing ceremony. And you can see that the spike, the upward momentum in this curve began really began to steepen during the Tokyo Olympics, and it ended somewhat a few weeks after the Tokyo Olympics ended. Now, normally in an Olympics, there's a lot of travel, right? There's a lot of international travel. Stadiums are full. Well, the stadiums weren't full. Japan didn't allow any international audience, any international spectators. So one might think that without any international spectators, that poses a problem. How would the Olympics contribute to a rise in COVID without international spectators? Well, one thing we can do is we can ask, is there data about this? So we can go, just like we can go to Our World in Data for the COVID information, we can go to the Japan Tourism Board for information on monthly travel. And they keep this back to 1996. And they have, in this case, I've selected the Japan-bound statistics. So this is people who enter Japan, overseas residents who enter Japan. And it's available on a monthly basis. So at the end of the month, they tally up the visitors to Japan. And the default plot runs from 2017 through 2021. And you can see there are 2 to 3 million visitors a month, every month in 2017, 2018, and 2019. And then in 2020, it drops. And in 2021, it's very, very few visitors. So can we use this? Does this make sense? Well, we can download the data and do the same thing that we did with the COVID data itself. So let's do that. So this is what I've done. I've downloaded the data, and now I've reproduced the plot. So this is the same data, the same plot that we see here. I've just done it according to my aesthetics, but it's basically the same data. You can see the upward one in April. I suppose people are there to see the cherry blossoms and so on. And the dramatic drop in tourism at the beginning of 2020, and the very little tourism, or the very little inbound traffic in 2021. Let me get my face out of there so the colors make sense. But you might notice this little blip here. So what happens if we get rid of every other year and just turn our attention to 2021? Then we see this. We see this drop in tourism, even from 2020, this drop in tourism in 2021, and it's around 10,000 visitors a month until the month of July. And then in the month of July, it goes up by about fivefold to 50,000 visitors, and then starts to come down. So this is just before the Olympics. We see this drop after the Olympics as people are exiting, and this massive jump just before the Olympics. Well, let's place this on top of the Olympic data and ask ourselves, how does this compare to when that surge happened? And you can see they parallel each other with a lag. So there's this fivefold increase in inbound visitors to Japan. And then if you remember, in the Olympics, even the athletes immediately after participating, they had to leave, within 24 hours of their last event. Some relatively short time after their last event, they had to leave. Of course, there are trainers, there are support staff. There were something like 80,000 volunteers who came in from all over Japan to help. I think the initial number was supposed to be larger, and it may have ended up to be somewhat smaller because they didn't allow overseas spectators. They did still allow, in the larger venues, up to 10,000 spectators per event. It was either 10,000 spectators or half of the capacity, depending whichever was smaller. So here, what we see is this very clear spike. Now, I'm not saying it's causal, but I'm saying this very clear spike, fivefold spike in inbound visitors from overseas into Japan, and then a month or so lag, and then an increase in cases in Japan, and then this steep fall off, which also corresponds to when everybody left. All the overseas visitors left the country. So does that help us understand what may have happened? I think it does. I think it offers a much better explanation than ivermectin. But is it enough? What else was going on? Well, Dr. Campbell notes that there was an increase in vaccination during the same period. And there was. So Japan started their vaccination program quite late, but then they ramped up very, very quickly. And so during the Olympics itself, this is from the same Our World in Data download. And what I'm plotting here is the percentage that are fully vaccinated. Now, there's some missing data here, so that's why these lines start to get dashed. But the percentage fully vaccinated, it peaks at somewhere approaching 80% now. But you can see there's a very steep rise. This is much faster than most countries did their vaccine rollouts, even if their overall vaccination rate was quite high. It just started a little bit later. But that also overlapped with the Olympics, and certainly overlaps with when the peak was and when the turnaround was. So if we look at all three of these, what do we see? We see this. The Olympics occurred a month after a fivefold increase in inbound overseas visitors coming into Japan. The Olympics themselves brought people from all over Japan to work as volunteers, and brought people from all over Japan to, in some ways, volunteer as spectators, because overseas spectators were not allowed. Then, as soon as the athletic events were over, people left. The number of people coming into Japan went back down to its extraordinarily low levels during the pandemic. Cases started to subside, and at the same time, there was this massive vaccination program which was being taken up all over the country and is paralleled in very few countries that have this amount of vaccination. While I think we can't just take associations like this and infer causality. I think that's a mistake. I think it would be a mistake to do it at this level from these Olympic data and the vaccination data. But I think it's less of a mistake than it is with ivermectin. We don't know anything about the uptake of ivermectin. We don't know anything about the influence that Dr. Osaka had in Tokyo. And why should we expect that he would have any influence outside of Tokyo? Anybody who's spent much time in Japan, I think, would scratch their heads at the idea of a lot of Japanese going out to buy an unapproved medication on short order because the president of their regional medical association said that it was a good idea. Now, so in that sense, what Dr. Campbell has done in this video is basically promote, it's not false because Dr. Ozaki really did say those things, but it's promoting an association that's just completely spurious. There's no reason to believe it except for fantasy. Now, Dr. Campbell is free to have his fantasies. I won't judge. But this kind of idea that this explains things, that this explains what's happened in Japan, that what the president of a regional medical association said explains the miracle in Japan is just fantastical. It's just fantastical. And he's free to believe it. And he's certainly free to tell his 1.4 million followers that they should believe that explanation for what's been happening in Japan. But I guess what I'm saying is that other people, including myself, are free to say that that's just nonsensical. And so that's where I'm going to leave this video. If you've stayed this far, thanks very much for watching, and feel free to leave your comments. Again, easy on the threats, but other than that, feel free to leave your comments, and I look forward to reading them.